She was the smallest woman in almost every locker room she ever walked into. She debuted as a background player in a three-person stable, spent years being told she wasn't quite ready for the top of the card, and got written off more times than most wrestlers get pushed. And now, she's a multi-time women's world champion, a Royal Rumble winner, and one of the most dangerous names on Monday Night Raw. This is the story of how Liv Morgan went from underdog to main event, and why her rise might be the most underrated redemption arc in modern WWE history. Before she was Liv Morgan, she was Gianna Daddio, a competitive cheerleader from Elmwood Park, New Jersey. Born June 8, 1994, she didn't come up through the indie wrestling scene the way a lot of her peers did. She signed with WWE back in 2014 and was sent to the Performance Center, where she spent years grinding in NXT, not as a flashy prospect being groomed for stardom, but as a smaller, scrappier talent who had to prove she belonged in a room full of bigger, more conventionally star-looking competitors. That underdog framing wasn't just a story WWE told about her. It was baked into how she was used. When she finally got called up to the main roster in 2017, she wasn't given a singles push or a spotlight entrance. She was placed into a trio called the Riott Squad, alongside Ruby Riott and Sarah Logan. On paper, Liv was the least experienced of the three, and for a long stretch, she was booked that way, the group's rookie, the one who got beat up first so her more established stablemates could look strong. But here's the thing about underdog booking. It only works if the performer underneath it is good enough to make people care anyway. And even in a supporting role, Liv Morgan had something that's genuinely hard to teach. She was believable. Her selling was visceral. Her matches felt physical in a way that cut through the noise, and fans started gravitating toward her specifically, even when the story wasn't designed to highlight her. The Riott Squad dissolved in 2019, and that's really where Liv Morgan's story splits in two. On one hand, she was finally a singles competitor with her own feuds, most notably a bitter, personal rivalry with her former Riott Squad ally-turned-rival. On the other hand, this era is where the underdog label started to feel less like a story device and more like a ceiling. For years, Liv floated in the mid-card. She had good matches. She had a passionate, vocal fan base. But the world title picture kept moving around her, not through her. If you were watching WWE during this stretch, you know the narrative that built up around her. Liv Morgan deserves more. It became something close to a meme in the fan community, not because people doubted her ability, but because it felt so obvious that WWE hadn't figured out what to do with someone who was clearly over with the crowd but wasn't a traditional powerhouse or a decorated amateur wrestler. She found real success in tag team wrestling during this period too, first alongside partners like Sonya Deville, picking up WWE Women's Tag Team Gold. It kept her featured, kept her championship adjacent, but the single spotlight, the one that turns a talented wrestler into a defining star of an era, still hadn't arrived. Then came 2022, specifically July 2nd, 2022, Money in the Bank. Liv Morgan climbed the ladder in the Women's Money in the Bank match, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't the plucky supporting piece of someone else's story. She was the one standing on top of the ladder, briefcase in hand, guaranteed a championship opportunity whenever she wanted to cash it in. And then she did something almost nobody saw coming. She didn't wait. She didn't save the briefcase for a dramatic, weeks-long build. That same night, Liv cashed in on SmackDown Women's Champion Ronda Rousey, one of the most dominant, credentialed forces in the entire women's division, and beat her for the title. Think about the symbolism of that moment for a second. This was a wrestler who'd spent years being framed as too small, too green, too far down the pecking order, and she just pinned one of the most legitimized fighters on the roster, on the very night she won the briefcase with zero hesitation. It wasn't a slow-burn underdog story anymore. It was a statement. That championship reign and the confidence it signaled changed how WWE and how fans saw Liv Morgan going forward. She wasn't a someday main eventer anymore. She'd already done it. The next chapter of Liv's evolution came through partnership. Teaming with Raquel Rodriguez, Liv became part of a genuinely dominant tag team. Together, they captured the WWE Women's Tag Team Championship a record 4 times. More reigns as a pairing than any team in the title's history. That kind of sustained success doesn't happen by accident. It takes chemistry, consistency, and a level of trust from the company that Liv had spent years trying to earn. But the biggest shift in this era wasn't about titles at all. It was about persona. In 2024, Liv Morgan aligned herself with the Judgment Day, the villainous stable that had already reshaped the top of WWE's card. Turning heel and joining forces with Dominic Mysterio, JD McDonough, and the rest of the group gave Liv something she'd never really had before, an edge. A meanness, a sense that she wasn't just fighting to be respected anymore. She was fighting because she decided she deserved to be feared. That same year, she added another accomplishment to her resume, becoming the inaugural WWE Women's Crown Jewel Champion in 2024. One more piece of hardware validating that she'd moved from solid upper mid-carder to legitimate championship-level talent. This stretch of her career also included real physical setbacks, injuries that forced her to relinquish tag gold and step away from the ring at points when her momentum was arguably at its peak. And that's part of what makes her story land the way it does. This wasn't a clean, uninterrupted climb. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, over and over for the better part of a decade. Which brings us to 2026, arguably the single best year of Liv Morgan's career. It started in January when Liv won the Women's Royal Rumble match. If you know anything about WWE's calendar, you know what that means: a guaranteed championship match at WrestleMania, the single biggest stage in the company. For a performer who spent years being overlooked for exactly these kinds of opportunities, winning the Rumble wasn't just a match result. It was WWE handing her the keys to the industry's biggest weekend. And she didn't waste it. At WrestleMania 42, Liv Morgan defeated Stephanie Vaquer to become Women's World Champion for the 3rd time in her career, sealing what fans and commentators started calling her revenge tour, a run defined by an athlete who'd been doubted, injured, and passed over, finally standing at the very top of the mountain with the title raised over her head. Which brings us to 2026. Arguably the single best year of Liv Morgan's career. It started in January when Liv won the Women's Royal Rumble match. If you know anything about WWE's calendar, you know what that means: a guaranteed championship match at WrestleMania, the single biggest stage in the company. For a performer who spent years being overlooked for exactly these kinds of opportunities, winning the Rumble wasn't just a match result. It was WWE handing her the keys to the industry's biggest weekend. And she didn't waste it. At WrestleMania 42, Liv Morgan defeated Stephanie Vaquer to become Women's World Champion for the 3rd time in her career, sealing what fans and commentators started calling her revenge tour, a run defined by an athlete who'd been doubted, injured, and passed over, finally standing at the very top of the mountain with the title raised over her head.